and welcome to the 51st lecture in this NPTEL course on the 20th century women's novel. In the last couple of minutes of the previous lecture, I very briefly introduced the writer and the novel that we would be discussing next, and that's what I will propose to do in this and the subsequent lecture. The writer is Toni Morrison, and the novel is Beloved. Before I start discussing the specific cultural and theoretical backgrounds for this text, I just want to say a couple of things about Beloved and Toni Morrison. Toni Morrison today is an American icon, a household name, and her influence and her momentous place, the important space that she occupies in the canon of modern American literature cannot be overstated. In fact, it would not be inaccurate to say that modern American literature, or the 20th and the 21st century African American novel, actually the American novel, emerges from Toni Morrison's work. And the contemporary American novel as we know it would not exist if it were not for Toni Morrison. And while Morrison's work as a whole is very powerful and gives a very distinct voice and shape to the American experience, to the meaning of what it means to be American, what it means to live in the aftermath of chattel slavery, and how one can pay attention to the voices of the many African American individuals who together have shaped what we know today as America. So all that is true. But within that body of work, Beloved occupies an even more exalted position. And I'll speak a little bit about that, why that is so, and then go into a biographical and then a theoretical discussion of how we can approach and appreciate the complexity and the power of this text. Beloved occupies an exalted place in the American canon because it is an act of historical recovery, while at the same time a very powerful observation and description of the lives of a few individual human beings. Individuals who can be treated as universal markers of humanity, irrespective of their racial or historical positions. Both of these things are true. It's possible to universalize the experiences of Sethi, Paul D, and Beloved. But at the same time, at some point, that process of universalization, the process of treating these individuals as merely human, as if race, culture, language, location do not matter, that process becomes impossible. And so, what we get while we appreciate and understand the novel, and while we immerse ourselves in the fates of these individuals, we learn how what we call universally human actually emerges from a very racialized experience. So, in a way, Morrison's work does what George Lukács's work in the early 20th century did for the working class. That is to say, the idea of humanity, the idea of progress, the idea of social development, all of these things for Lukács in 1920s when he was writing History and Class Consciousness, the very definition of history as had been received in the German philosophical tradition from Hegel was not coming to consciousness of a universal human spirit, but rather the coming to consciousness of the working class as a community, as the working class, as workers of Europe and the world united and became aware of their position in the global financial economy and their agency, their ability to keep the global financial economy running, as the workers came to a realization of their centrality. that was the evolution of humanity over history. So, just as Lukács places the consciousness of the worker as the driving force for the evolution of human history, similarly, in a literary textual context, within the history of reading the English novel, and especially the English novel as it was practiced in the 20th century, Toni Morrison brings home to readers the centrality of the experience of the African American community or the diasporic African community, the centrality of this experience to our understanding of what we call the human or the universally human experience that the novel as a genre helps us understand. So, the centrality of the African American experience and describing that as a way of creating the humanity of the novel. This is why Beloved occupies an especially exalted place in both Toni Morrison's oeuvre as well as the 20th and 21st century American novel. Now, where does this come from, or what exactly empowers Morrison? Of course, individual genius cannot be denied, but it's also not very interesting to talk about in an academic context. So while I'm not denying the individual genius of Morrison, I will focus on a couple of biographical details to understand how this novel came to be. The first biographical detail is that Morrison worked both as a writer, that is, both as a public facing practitioner of a verbal and rhetorical skill. At the same time, Morrison also worked as an academic. Morrison completed her master's and began teaching in Texas at first, and then moved after many years to Cornell. Between these two university stints, Morrison worked as the senior fiction editor for Random House. And it was in this role as the senior fiction editor that Morrison took on this role of the literary gatekeeper and decided to not keep the gates closed, but to open them very wide for a particular kind of writing. A lot of African American writers, and actually not just American, but Black writers, period, had their careers begun, amplified, supported, and fast tracked because of the kind of guidance, mentorship, and support they received from Toni Morrison. So, this is the first thing I want to note. The second is that there's an important function of historical recovery that's going on. Morrison was not just a writer and a teacher, but also a public intellectual. And in her work as a public intellectual, Morrison did or advocated and campaigned for a great deal of historical recovery. By recovery, I mean Morrison was interested in bringing to the public consciousness stories that, for some reason, had been removed. And these stories primarily concerned the lives and the experiences of individuals from the African diaspora. And it was while editing one such volume that Morrison came to the story which would eventually become Beloved. Before I come to that, I want to mention a few facts, a few biographical facts. Morrison was born Chloe Ardelia Wolford in the year 1931 in Lorain, Ohio. Born to a solidly working class African American family. And this was a family which like many others, had migrated from slave owning southern states and had very vivid and recent memories of the violence of slavery. Morrison's father worked many jobs and ensured that Morrison would not have to make a living through the labor of her body. And as a result, Morrison had a very rich, eclectic, very well exposed cultural and literary education. Among the writers Morrison mentions reading and being inspired by were from the European canon, so Jane Austen, Leo Tolstoy, Gustave Flaubert, and others, while Morrison worked as a secretary for the head librarian at the Lorraine Public Library. Now, in the year 1949, Morrison enrolled at Howard University. Those of you who are aware of the history of civil rights will know that Harvard University, like many others, is among the most famous HBCUs, that is historically black colleges and universities. And Morrison was very careful in choosing to go to Howard because she sought the company of fellow African American and black intellectuals, and encountered also at Howard, and during her college years, Morrison encountered racially segregated restaurants and buses for the first time because it was a relatively bigger city than the semi-integrated town of Lorain, Ohio, from where she came. It was during these years that Chloe Wofford also changed her name to Toni Morrison, and the word Toni was derived from Saint Anthony of Padua, whose name she took upon converting to Catholicism. So this is a very important fact, and in fact, this is important for a lot of writers and cultural artists. The religious beliefs and being a devout Catholic was a very important part of Morrison's worldview, and I believe it also shapes a great deal of the philosophical and ethical treatments of very complex issues that we find in her novel. This is something that in some ways can go against the radical strain of recovery, the radical strain of educating people about the importance of Black lives and how Black lives matter, and why Black lives do matter more than other lives, and why the recovery of this process of mattering, and not just the process of mattering, but also the process of the erasure of Black lives. So, all of these recovery and intellectual and emotional tasks, this can tend to go against some of the conservative religious views that being a very devout Catholic brings with it. But this is only an apparent contradiction. It is not a very deep or a real contradiction. In fact, there are a great many conservative Catholic intellectuals who campaigned and made civil rights possible. Martin Luther King Jr. was a celebrated preacher, and the church where he spoke is still very widely attended and among the most vibrant spaces in downtown Atlanta even today. So there is a very deep connection between the way the institutional church, the institutional Christianity has been very usefully deployed and used by Black writers and intellectuals, and Morrison was part of that culture. Now, after finishing her bachelor's, Morrison completed her master's at Cornell and wrote a master's thesis on Virginia Woolf and William Faulkner. This is a very important subject and gives us a clue as to the kind of textual dynamics we are about to encounter in the novel Beloved. Virginia Woolf's work, at a very, very general and from a very zoomed out level, signifies the importance of the speaking voice, the stream of consciousness, and privileges the perspective of a single protagonist, usually female, very well educated, very deeply perceptive, deeply sensitive, and sensitive to the point of almost paralysis. But nonetheless, the fiction gives centrality to the perceiving and the thinking consciousness of a single female protagonist. This is something that we find in Beloved as well, and is also very powerfully helps us connect Beloved to the history of the 20th century English novel, in especially in the ways that this English novel was sort of turbocharged by the kind of formal innovations that writers like Virginia Woolf introduced into a genre which until then had been quite conservative in many ways. So this is the radical, turbocharged, formally complex innovative, self-reflexive version of the English novel that Toni Morrison inherits. One part of that inheritance is from Virginia Woolf. The other part of that influence, as signified in the master's thesis title, comes from William Faulkner. Now, those of you who know a little bit about American literature and 20th century American literature will have obviously heard the name of William Faulkner, a great modernist writer, winner of the Nobel Prize from the deep south state of Mississippi, in fact, from the city of Oxford, Mississippi. William Faulkner was a great chronicler of the contradictions, the darkness, and the legacies of slavery in rural Deep South America. But what's unique about Faulkner's work is that while, of course, Faulkner was deeply influenced by the formal innovations of the high modernist novel, and Faulkner is cited as among the greatest practitioners of stream of consciousness. In fact, the novel The Sound and the Fury contains a brilliant stream of consciousness from the perspective of Benji, an intellectually disabled protagonist. Now, this is true, but what's more important for our discussion of Morrison and the treatment of slavery as a very violent history, whose aftermath nevertheless continues to shape the lives of countless individuals. What's more important about this history from in the work of William Faulkner is that Faulkner is among the earliest pioneers of what can be called the Southern Gothic. The Southern Gothic is not really a Gothic that's set in the South, but rather a way of perceiving the landscape, the geography, the culture, and especially the architecture of the American South as haunted. The American South appears to be haunted because it is built on the labor of a lot of black bodies, bodies of people who have been killed, maimed, transported across the seas, and on whom a whole range of atrocities have been committed. But that's not all. It's not that violence was committed. It's not just that black bodies were transported as chattel, as property, were made to labor, and on the basis of that labor, the southern landscape was built. That's not all. What makes the southern landscape haunted is that it is not acknowledged. This violence is not acknowledged. There's no official public record of such violence. In fact, this violence is brushed under the carpet, as it were. It is forcibly suppressed, hidden, and not revealed. Now, of course, such processes of hiding, concealment never work. And so anyone with the least sensitivity and the least keenness can see that there are tombs or markers or symptoms or signs of this violence. Which violence? The suffering of the countless African and African American individuals whose labor was used to create the prosperity, the material, the economic prosperity, and the material comforts of the American South. Now, a work that can help us understand exactly what the Southern romance would look like without any acknowledgement of the racism and slavery. The romance novel Gone with the Wind by Margaret Mitchell. This novel focuses on a plantation named Tara and does not focus on any of the labor or the violence that may have been used to create the plantation. Instead, it focuses on the troubles, the economic and the emotional troubles of the individuals who live there. And it is billed and sold and read and celebrated, even in the film, as a great romance. This is a typical example of what a Southern plantation narrative would look like if the real source of that plantation or the real means of production of that plantation, which is slavery, is not acknowledged. In fact, Gone with the Wind can be understood to be the exact opposite or the counter to what we find in novels by William Faulkner. Novels such as A Rose for Emily, Leaf in August, or As I Lay Dying. Characters are haunted. Everyone is melancholic. Everyone is teetering on the verge of collapse. And they don't know why, but we know why, and Faulkner knows why. And the narrator does more than a fair bit to help readers connect this unacknowledged violence on which the South was built with the kind of melancholia and mysterious, undiagnosed sadness that inflicts all other characters. So in Faulkner, haunting is dispersed as a mood. Everyone is haunted. Nobody seems to know why. Everybody has a suspicion as to why. And the reader is left to figure out how these centuries of slavery might have left a mark, and that at a societal, communal, collective level, if violence or suffering is not acknowledged, then it can lead to a lot of damaging consequences. It can disable entire societies from being able to function, feel, think, acknowledge, become conscious of who they are. So that the refusal at the level of a culture and a society to acknowledge the violence on which it was built can lead to a profound alienation of that society. This is a kind of lesson that one can draw from Faulkner's novels. But in terms of a cultural history, in terms of how later 20th and 21st century American narratives about the American South developed, Faulkner lays the foundations and enables later writers to inhabit this mode of perceiving the American South as haunted. It's haunted because what we see is not the full picture. In fact, what we see is an indication that we need to uncover more secrets, that we need to look behind the corners, between the lines, read between the lines, think or wonder or speculate what's underneath these unmarked graves. What is this landscape hiding? So there's this constant state of low grade or sometimes high grade paranoia and anxiety, which whenever we see a very peaceful and idyllic looking plantation and a beautiful sight of this porch where the sun is shining and the grass is green and everything looks very warm and happy and cozy, the immediate suspicion that comes is, what is it hiding? Where are the bodies buried, right? And this suspicion, paranoia, fear is interpreted and practiced in a wide range of narrative forms. Southern Gothic is so widespread a trend and a category and an aesthetic and a mode of writing that it can be found in all kinds of cultural narratives. Novels are only one small instance and not a very well-known instance. One can find it in music, one can find it in a lot of popular horror survival genres. The Walking Dead, a very popular American TV series, is very directly an inheritor of the Southern Gothic. There are countless video games. In fact, the genre of the zombie survivor film, game, etc., is also a direct descendant of the Southern Gothic. But none of that is important here. What's important to us now is the aesthetic, the ghostly, haunted mood, or to use a more 21st century social media a happy term, vibe. What is the mood and what is the mode which we are called haunted? How does that emerge from the unacknowledged history of slavery? And what did Morrison do with it? What gives the haunted effect of Morrison's novel? Its historical motivations. And if the novel is haunted, and if the novel is written to produce a sense of haunting, it clearly describes characters who are haunted. it describes a ghost as well. If the novel is describing these things, what is the intended historical or ethical goal behind it? This is the question we need to answer. And I'll provide a brief historical background to how and why Morrison got motivated and was inspired to undertake a task of historical recovery by writing a novel which was not a typical historical novel. In fact, the category of novel that applies most accurately to Beloved is not historical novel, but the postmodernist novel. The postmodernist novel, as I will describe a little bit later, is fundamentally opposed to any such tasks of historical recovery. Postmodernism most famously was defined as the suspicion or the falling away or the disenfranchisement of grand historical narratives. And most specifically, postmodern theorists referred to the historical narratives of communism, the workers' revolutions, the 1968 revolutions, the fall of the Berlin Wall. These are seen as important 20th century historical events in which the narrative of communism is perceived to have failed in producing social change, but also failed in giving readers and individuals, whether these individuals were reading novels or listening to music, communism failed to give meaning to these lives. And so, historical recovery, which was seen as a direct descendant of the socialist narrative, was also discredited. In fact, what we find in Beloved is a re empowerment and a recovery of this socialist historical argument of recovery. The novel very firmly invites us to undertake tasks of recovery on our own, and it is by thinking about the legacies of chattel slavery and how they have shaped Black lives in 20th and 21st century America that the novel teaches us how to do that. I'll stop this discussion here and continue in the next lecture. Thank you.